The first beta version of the brand new macOS 26 Tahoe has just been released, and as it's still supporting Intel Macs, let's compare and benchmark Intel versus Apple Silicon. Welcome to Jesse's Flying. As the first developer beta of macOS 26 Tahoe was just released, and it still supports a few Intel Macs, which Intel Macs you can see here in my video. But that raises immediately the question, how are the Intel Macs holding up against Apple Silicon? And therefore I installed that developer beta on the latest MacBook Pro with Intel chip, that is the MacBook Pro from 2020, maximum specs, against the base model Apple Silicon M1 Mac Mini, both from 2020. And I'd like to compare boot times, overall handling, and obviously some performance benchmarks, how those two Macs, both from 2020, compare to each other. Also, I did these benchmarks with macOS Sequoia to have an idea, does macOS Tahoe with a new glass overview interface, does that slows the Macs down, and especially the Intel Macs, knowing that it's still a developer beta and not the final version. And to set it into perspective, I also benched the MacBook Pro with an M4 Pro chip with macOS Sequoia to see the difference between the last Intel Mac, the base model Apple Silicon M1, and the latest version of the M4 Pro. Let's go. So the most obvious change in the new macOS is obviously the version numbering, because Apple had version numbers all over the place, from macOS, iPadOS, iOS, watchOS, tvOS, and visionOS, and Apple streamlined that into the version number 26 because it's made for the year 2026. The next big difference that was shown on the keynote is the new liquid glass design, and you may like it or not, but I'd like to compare Intel Mac versus ARM Apple Silicon Mac, if maybe that is handling well on Intel, and how is the feeling of that. And for the first part, let's compare the boot times of the MacBook Pro 2020 with an Intel chip against the Mac Mini with an Apple Silicon chip, also from 2020. And here you can see the Mac Mini is done from entering the password, because firewall is on, to showing up the dock in about 10 seconds. While the MacBook Pro needs more than double the time just to boot from entering the password in firewall up to showing the dock. And after booting, the MacBook Pro has the fans, both fans on maximum RPM for about 5 more minutes, because the Intel chip is at about 95 degrees at the beginning, cooling it down to about, right now, 50 degrees Celsius. And that is a big impact that you feel with the ARM chips, for instance in the Mac Mini, that just stays about 30 degrees Celsius the whole time, and the fan is just on minimum RPM the whole boot sequence. But there is another big difference in macOS Tahoe, and that is if you click on the apps icon. That was the Launchpad before, and I didn't saw any announcement in the keynote where they announced that they got rid of the Launchpad. This is now like an extended window of the Spotlight search, because you have the search up here, and then you have some suggestions, and you have categories like productivity, utilities, travel, and so on. And if you go to social, you can say show more, and you also see some icons that have a little gray box in the lower right corner, because these apps only exist on my iPhone. And as I'm in the same Apple account, you could open that app up on your phone via screen mirroring. And it doesn't have to be on the macOS device like the MacBook Pro here. And so as soon as you start to enter anything up here in the search bar, and you have the Apple TV app that is on the MacBook Pro, and you have the Apple TV app that is on my iPhone, and it shows all the apps in here. And when you start this search up, you can see that takes about a second on the MacBook Pro, while when I click that on the Mac Mini, it more or less appears instantaneously. So here's the first feel how good the Apple ARM chips can handle the new features. Another big difference between the Intel and the Apple Silicon Macs obviously is Apple Intelligence. So when we go to the system settings, and you can see maybe that the MacBook Pro with an Intel chip is a little stuttering. It's not that fluent when you close it or bring it back up again, compared to the Mac Mini that is completely fluid. On the Intel MacBook Pro, it just states Siri. Because up here in the Mac Mini with Apple Silicon, you can turn on Apple Intelligence. So that is the big difference that Intel Macs cannot handle. But as there's already a difference in performance in the overall feel between the Intel Mac and the Apple Silicon Mac, let's just move on to the benchmarks and if there is maybe an even more difference. Before we start with the benchmarks, let's talk about the Mac models. What is inside and how much power can they draw and how do they dissipate all that heat, that power that they take. Let's start with the Intel MacBook Pro. That's officially the MacBook Pro 16-inch 2019, but this specific model was released in 2020. This MacBook Pro has an Intel i9 9th generation CPU that can draw on its own 45 watts because the graphic card can also draw 50 watts, which makes a total power draw of 95 watts. So keep that in mind. There are 95 watts at energy as heat that have to be dissipated, and we'll see that in a minute when we talk about fan speeds and temperatures. The next thing is the Mac Mini 2020 with an base configuration M1 chip. And that chip can draw 14 watts, including the graphic unit that is integrated, because that graphic unit can draw on its own 10 watts. So there's 4 watts left for CPU power when you do gaming or something like that. So 95 watts in the MacBook Pro Intel version against 14 watts with the Mac Mini. And then for comparison, my MacBook Pro with an M4 Pro chip that also has a power draw of 45 watts, including the graphic unit that is in the M4 Pro chip, because the graphic unit can draw 32 watts on its own, which has a remaining 12 watts for the CPU. How does that work in benchmarks? Let's start with the Cinebench benchmark, which only benches CPU power, rendering power. And the first is in macOS Sequoia, the single core performance. And you can see that the Intel chip has about 72, while the M1 chip in the Mac Mini already has 113. And the M4 Pro single core performance is 2.5 times the Intel chip with 174. I also listed the amount of cores because that's only one core. The Intel chip has 8 cores, 16 threads. That means that every core can handle 2 threads at a time, but it has 8 real physical cores, while the M1 only has 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores that are way slower than the performance cores. while the M4 Pro, as it's a Pro chip, has 10 performance cores and 4 additional efficiency cores. So the speed in macOS Tahoe developer beta that I tested is about the same. Because that is a synthetic benchmark, why shouldn't be there any difference? Talking about the multi-core performance, there you got it. The Intel chip in the MacBook Pro has about the same CPU performance than the M1. Why? It has more cores. It has only 70 points per core, but times 8 cores, while the M1 only has the 4 performance cores and the efficiency cores doesn't bring that much to the table. So the CPU power, the CPU performance of those two 2020 Macs is about the same. And 4 years later, the MacBook Pro M4 Pro has more than 3 times the performance of these 2020 Macs. Let's go on to Tahoe, and I tested the both 2020 Macs in Tahoe, multi-core performance. There's a little bit of a difference, but no trend visible, and I would just say these 20-30 points are just about differences in the benchmarks. So nothing that you can distinguish here between Sequoia and Tahoe. Let's move on to the temperatures. And as we talked about the wattage just before, the MacBook Pro with an Intel chip has an idle temperature, CPU temperature of 50 degrees Celsius. And it ramps up to 95 degrees Celsius when it's under full load. That's near the maximum temperature that is allowed for that Intel chip. The Mac Mini has an idle temperature of about 30 degrees Celsius, and that ramps up to about 75. So the same difference. It's both about 45 degrees more when it's under load. The M4 Pro has an idle temperature of 40 and ramps up only to about 90 degrees. That's 50 degrees difference, but a little bit cooler than the Intel chip. But the interesting part is now, what do the fan speeds do? And therefore you can see that the Intel MacBook Pro has an idle fan speed of 30%. That's about 1500 RPM, but they are always on. And they ramp up to 100%, that's 5500 RPM, and barely can keep the chip at 95 degrees Celsius. So that's quite loud and very noisy fan speeds. While the Mac Mini has an idle speed of 40%, that's 1700 RPM, and it just stays there. It only has 14 watts to dissipate, and so the fan just remains at 1700. You won't hear it, and it keeps it 70 degrees, no problem. And now comes the advantage of the ARM chip of the M4 Pro. When you do everyday tasks, like right now I'm showing that presentation, the fans are off, 0. And it keeps about 40 degrees Celsius. And during full load, which is 45 watts, the fans only ramp up to about 70%, which is about 4 to 4,500 RPM, and way less noisy than the Intel version. You hear them, obviously, but they are way less noisy than the Intel MacBook Pro, because that's only 45 watts to dissipate, not 95 watts in total. Talking about Novabench. Novabench is another benchmark that benches every part of the Mac. And let's talk about the total score in macOS Sequoia. And here, same picture, the Intel MacBook Pro and the Mac Mini with Apple Silicon are about the same total scoring, while the M4 Pro has more than double, 2.5 times the power of both of them. The CPU scores, same, a little bit more for the M1 and 2.5 times more on the M4 Pro. You have the GPU power, and here you can see the dedicated AMD Radeon graphics card that on its own can draw 50 watts in the Intel MacBook Pro, is about double the speed than the integrated graphics in the Mac Mini that can only draw 10 watts, obviously. The M4 Pro has 409 against nearly 300 in the AMD Radeon. So that's also more than 30% more GPU power, even though it's only 32 watts compared to 50 watts in the Intel MacBook Pro. And the memory speed about the same for the 2020 Mac models and double for the 2024 M4 Pro. So that's another hardware advantage of newer Macs, that the memory speed increases, so all macOS things that you do feel way more snappy due to the faster memory also. Talking about the comparison, Sequoia against the developer beta of Tahoe, and here you can see all the values from those two 2020 models are about the same. Again, another synthetic benchmark, so I didn't expect any difference between Sequoia and Tahoe. For shits and giggles, I just added my iPhone 15 Pro that I'm recording with right now to the benchmarks, because it's the A17 Pro chip. It has 6 cores and it has a total wattage of 8 watts. Passively cooled, obviously, in the iPhone. There are no data how much the GPU part, that also has 6 cores, can draw on its own, but at least a total power draw of 8 watts. And so I did the Geekbench with these 4 models. Single core performance. The Intel chip 1533, that's way less than the M1, as we already saw. The single core performance increased with the Apple Silicon chip. But funny enough, the single core performance of the iPhone 15 Pro is higher than the M1 in the Mac Mini. It's 2400 against 2900. Obviously, as we already saw, the M4 Pro chip has nearly 4000, so quite an increase on the single CPU core performance. Multi-core. And here you see that my iPhone has the same CPU performance in Geekbench than the 2020 Intel MacBook Pro. With an i9 95 watts full fan blasting power, you can just use your iPhone with the same CPU power. The M1 is a little bit faster, 8800 against the 7000 score. And obviously the M4 Pro, 22,000 points. That's more than 3 times the CPU power here in the Geekbench. Let's go over to the graphic performance. OpenCL, and the iPhone doesn't have OpenCL support, so there's no benchmark for that. But you can see that the dedicated AMD Radeon graphics card in the Intel MacBook Pro, 50 watts against the integrated M1 graphic card, same picture here, 35,000 against 21,000 scores. But you can see that the M4 Pro chip is about double the speed than the AMD Radeon from 2020. So that makes quite a decent gaming chip. And comparing Metal, the Apple graphic interface, you can see that the iPhone has about 28,000, with the M1 has 34,000. Also here, the dedicated AMD Radeon in the Intel MacBook has about 55,000, so nearly double the score of the M1. And the M4 Pro has double the scoring again as the AMD Radeon. And then I did some 3D Mark benchmarks. I did Steel Nomad, which is the newest one, Wildlife Extreme, and Solar Bay, which is the oldest one. And these benchmarks are only for ARM architecture. So I couldn't test the Intel MacBook Pro. But I tested my iPhone and the M1 chip and the M4 Pro chip. And there you can see for Steel Nomad, the scoring of the iPhone, nearly 1300 points against 2000 points in the M1. So the overall package of the M1 is quite a little bit better, but it has nearly double the amount of wattage, 8 against 14 watts that it can draw. And the M4 Pro, nearly 4 times faster than the M1, nearly 8000 scoring against 2000. With Wildlife Extreme, the same picture, just higher scoring. Now the Mac Mini is nearly double the speed than the iPhone, and the M4 Pro is more than 3 times the speed of the M1. And for Solar Bay, same picture here, but the iPhone A17 Pro chip is keeping up quite good. So that's the reason why there's so much mobile gaming going on iPhones or iPads, which have the same chips. Passively cooled, but keeping quite up good with the graphic power. But these scorings, how do they translate in frames per second? How playable is that? So let's go to the frames per second, and you can see the Mac Mini with the Steel Nomad 14.6 frames per second. That's not playable. There are stutters and it's loading, and you need at least 25 to 30 frames to have playable frames per second. The iPhone has 9.5, so not playable at all. But the M4 Pro, nearly 60 frames. That's a good gaming machine for the latest benchmark. A little bit older, Wildlife Extreme, and there you can see the M1 has already 24 frames, so that's quite playable, a little bit stuttering, but okay. The iPhone 18 frames, nah, not really. It's a benchmark, it's not a game. And 107 for the M4 Pro. So that's nearly 5 times the speed than the M1. And the oldest benchmark is the Solar Bay benchmark M1 30 frames. Nice and playable. The iPhone 21.3, barely okay. And 115 for the M4 Pro. So no problems at all for these benchmarks for the M4 Pro. Summary. The M1 base model against the latest Intel MacBook Pro is about the same CPU power, same memory speed, and due to the dedicated graphics card that can draw a lot of more power, the Intel MacBook Pro has more gaming performance. But it has annoying fan speeds, 5,500 RPM the whole time, and it gets really, really hot. So are those two Macs, like the MacBook Pro 2020 Intel and the Mac Mini 2020 M1, usable for gaming? More or less. If you play some older games, it depends what kind of games you play. If you're using the Mac Mini, you need obviously crossover or a virtual machine to run Windows games, but they can handle older games. Okay. But despite having the same CPU power and more graphics power in the Intel MacBook Pro, it's quite slower, at least in the first developer beta of macOS 26 Tahoe. It needs more than double the time to boot. All the animations feel a little bit sluggish, a little bit slower, knowing that this is just the first developer beta and Apple has about like 3 months to finish that up until the public first Tahoe version will be released. But you can already feel that it's meant for Apple Silicon. Other than that, the developer beta, I didn't find any bugs yet. They changed a little bit. They obviously changed the design towards the liquid glass, and they just got rid of the Launchpad. And I will continue checking all the betas that will be released in the next weeks and months. And as soon as there will be maybe a beta version of the Open Core Legacy patcher, you will find a video here on my channel. So I would recommend you really subscribe my channel, click the bell for notifications so you don't miss any updates. If you like to discuss all that topics, if you have some problems installing an unsupported macOS on your old Mac, here is my ultimate tutorial about that, where you find all the details how to do that. And I invite you to join our Discord community. The link is down in the video description. So join our Discord server. There are more than 3,500 members already growing. There's so much help, so much discussion going on if you want to discuss anything about Macs, unsupported Macs, Open Core, and so on. Right now, thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day. See you soon here on my channel. Bye bye.